We should go ahead and get started, I think. So we are here today to talk about taking care of fragile archival materials. And when we say fragile archival materials, we're meaning things that are brittle or very thin or have a lot of wear on them, maybe things that are torn, that you don't really have the capacity to mend. They need to go to a conservator, and you don't have that money. So what are the things we can do to take care of them? And we're going to talk, the first thing that I have to say about things that are very fragile is that if you can, it's really good to restrict access and provide surrogates for them if you have fragile materials that are heavily used. Because the more things are handled, the more likely they are to be damaged. So if we give people, the easiest thing is a nice photocopy, but you can also scan things and just have images on a disk. Scanned surrogates, just so that we're all clear on this, scanned surrogates are not digital preservation by any stretch of the imagination. It's just something that you can hand your researchers so they can use it. I'm a big fan of photocopy because photocopy is easy, it's pretty sturdy. You use alkaline buffered, acid-free paper, put things directly on you never put things through the sheet feeder of your copier if they matter to you because it will crunch them up. But just put them one at a time on a flatbed, on the bed of your copier, and then you have a copy that you can make copies off of to give to people. That's kind of my first resort because it's easy, it's cheap, it doesn't require any special technical expertise. If you're scanning and copying things that are very fragile, you can put the pages in Mylar folders, which will give them some support, but you can scan and copy through Mylar. And in terms of making a preservation photocopy, which is something that I do all the time for newspaper clippings. Newspaper clippings are something that I never recommend hanging on to because they're not interesting and they're just on a slow road to destruction anyhow. So you use good quality alkaline buffered paper. A brand name is Permalife. And I brought some Permalife paper around with me today. When we pass it out, if you hold it up to the light, actually I brought Permadur, but it's the same thing. You'll see a watermark in it that says the name of, actually I'll just send that around right now. You'll see a watermark in it that says the name of the paper. So that has an alkaline buffer in it that will neutralize acids as they're created, so that's going to last a long time. So you use that quality of paper for your preservation photocopies. And then the other trick is that you want to make sure that your toner is adhering properly to your paper. It's fusing. The way to do that is to run a copy of something and then take a piece of Scotch tape. Listen carefully because this may be the only time a conservator ever says to you, take a piece of Scotch tape. And press it down over your copy and pull it off. If the toner stays on your page, you're good to go. If the toner all pulls off on your tape, you have a problem and you need to get your copier adjusted. And then just one at a time, boom, boom, boom. And I would make one copy that I put in a file cabinet and never touch again except to make more copies off of it and let people use the use copy and just keep making new use copies as they get messed up. As far as storage, the best storage for any kind of paper really is so normal size paper up to legal size is in document boxes and file folders. But if something is oversized or very, very, very fragile, it's better off being stored flat. So because that way you get full support over the entire surface of your object. If I have it here, I'm getting some pressure against it, hopefully from other file folders. But here I'm getting pressure from the surface it's sitting on. And that gives us the most assurance we're going to be okay. Good quality file folders, acid-free, alkaline buffered. So when I say alkaline buffered, there's a chemical, usually magnesium hydroxide, that is in the paper pulp when the paper is made. And that neutralizes acids as they're formed. So because the acids in your paper want to move to paper that's less acidic, it will actually suck acid molecules out of your paper and into your alkaline buffered paper. So it'll slow deterioration in your piece of paper that's brittle, which is really exciting. For things that are very deteriorated, I also recommend in your folder putting some kind of a support board, either mat board or this is E-flute corrugated board. You could use 60-point board, really anything you have hanging around that is a sturdy, stable surface rather than folders which are kind of wobbly. And this will, again, provide a lot more support. When it comes down to plastic versus paper enclosures, for a lot of things, plastic is fantastic because you can actually see through the plastic. When we actually encapsulate something, we'll see that when we take it, if it's encapsulated, we can crumple it up in a ball and our paper's still going to survive. We can hand out something that is encapsulated or something that's in a plastic sleeve to your average 18-year-old who is using an archives for the first time in their life and be fairly confident they're not going to damage it. That's fantastic. However, plastic also speeds deterioration. That's because it doesn't breathe. So when paper deteriorates, what happens is there's an acid that comes from the air, pollution, bad quality file folder, the paper itself, it doesn't really matter. So you have an acid molecule. It interacts with a water molecule from humidity in the air and a paper molecule, and it breaks the paper molecule into two. And it releases another acid, which is then free to find the next water molecule and the next paper molecule and break that into two. So it keeps going and going and going and generating more and more and more acid molecules, and it just cleaves your paper fibers shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And the shorter your fibers are, the more brittle they become. It's kind of like if you have a sweater and you cut one stitch in the sweater, one loop in the sweater, it'll hold together. But if you cut enough loops, you end up with yarn fuzzies on the floor instead of that sweater. And paper gets brittle enough, you touch it, and it turns to cornflakes in your hand. It's pretty dramatic. And I did not bring any with me because it was not going to survive the suitcase. So in terms of deciding when to put things in plastic versus paper, plastic is great if you have heavily used objects that are modern and in good condition. You have a long time to go before they become brittle. Plastic sleeves are really good then. Plastic is also really good when things are so brittle that you can't handle them anymore without doing damage. That middle ground, I tend to go with paper because paper breathes, and paper we can use alkaline buffered paper. That's going to slow the deterioration down. So really good plastic, really bad plastic, everything else paper is kind of my rule of thumb. And then as far as handling, when we have things that are brittle, fragile, torn, first we want to handle them as little as possible because every time you handle things, there's a bigger chance of them breaking or getting more damage. And when we move them around, we want them supported. So move them in their folders. And I'm going to show you how to flip things because sometimes people want to see the back of the sheet of paper. Who knew? So I have this incredibly important brittle fragile document right here. and I need to look at the back of it. So I'm going to put it between two support boards, and this is blue, thin blue board, but you, again, 60-point board, phase box board, mat board, whatever you have hanging around will work. Pick it up. If you have a poster, you probably want two people to do this. You don't need to use a lot of pressure. I see people kind of going, you don't need to kill it, just a little, just lay your hand on top, flip, the paper's not going to fall out, and boom, it's safe to look at your object. So I'm going to send that around so everyone has a chance to mess with it and see how easy it is. It's always amazing to me that it doesn't slip out. It's slippery paper, it's slippery board, it stays right there. So the last thing on my agenda today, except for some question and answer time for you all to ask me about your collections, is we're going to encapsulate something. And encapsulation is kind of, this table is making me crazy. It keeps squeaking and moving. Encapsulation, we're going to put our document between two pieces of thin Mylar. We are using 2 mil, which is the thinnest. And that works great for little things. If you have bigger things, you might want to go up higher. And you all should have a handout, the National Park Service Conservogram with directions on encapsulation, so that you don't have to remember what I'm saying. I'm probably doing it a little bit less. They probably have more special equipment than we have, but the process will be the same. So first, everybody needs to have something to encapsulate. If you don't have a piece of paper you would like to encapsulate, half sheets are great because they're smaller, they're easier to hang on to. So if you don't have something you want to encapsulate, we have these lovely pads from the Sheraton that you can use a piece of. But maybe somebody gave you a really important business card, or you have notes from another class that you did this week, or something is interesting. And I guess I'm going to do that. So one trick you can do when you're encapsulating to counteract this whole acids not being able to escape is back your document with a piece of acid-free alkaline buffered paper. This only works for documents that have nothing on the back. Because if they have something on the back, you will be covering it up. So we're making these nice, cute little things, and our paper is bigger than this. So I'm going to want to cut this down. I usually want about 1/4 of an inch margin all the way around. We don't have any weights in here that would help us weight this down, but what we do have are drinking glasses, which are actually not terrible weights. So I'm just going to put the weight on top of my object, and we're going to cut around all 4 sides of it. Cutting. You want a straight edge. I would prefer that you had a heavier gauge straight edge than this little ruler, but this will work, especially for the not very much work we're doing today. These are cork-backed rulers, and you would think that you would cut with the cork side down, but you don't. That's because, first of all, the cork has a tendency to get really dirty and will leave smudges behind. But also, see how the cork doesn't go all the way out to the edges? That makes it very easy for your knife to slip under there and get a bad cut. So cork side up. It's so counterintuitive, but it works better. And then knives. We're using break-off knives in here, and that's what I tend to use most of the time when I'm cutting. Scalpels also work. I stay far, far away from X-Acto knives that have the screw-in blades because they get loose really easily, and I think they're really difficult to work with. And I have broken off the blades on these recently, so we know they're really sharp, but you always want to work with a very sharp knife. The cutting will work better, and you will be safer. You're less likely to get a bad cut on a sharp knife. And finally, when you're cutting, you're better off standing. I realize it's the end of the conference and everyone is tired, and that these tables are the absolute worst height for doing standing work. You really want something counter height. But if you all will indulge me by standing up to cut, it will make me feel much better. So I'm going to start by just cutting, and I am not doing any measuring on this. I am really not being fussy. I'm just going to cut about 1/4 of an inch all the way around. You're usually better off cutting towards yourself, so as you're cutting, you may want to move things in a circular direction so that you are always cutting towards yourself. Excuse me. And so hopefully, if we have done this right, we'll all end up with something that looks about like this. And what you're going to need next is 2 pieces of Mylar that are about 1 inch bigger than your object all the way around, maybe 2 inches. I'm going to kind of rough cut it. I would rough cut. So, and you can buy Mylar cut into sheets, which can be really convenient if you are going to be encapsulating a whole bunch of 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. You could buy like 10 by 12 Mylar or 10 by 14 Mylar, and then you wouldn't have to go through this annoying step of cutting it off the roll. However, buying it pre-cut is also a lot more expensive than buying it on a roll, so there's that balance as well. So we're going to be doing tape encapsulation. We're using tape to hold this together. If you ever end up working somewhere that is fancy and has lots of money, you can buy, I know, it's a dream. We can all dream. You can buy an ultrasonic welder that will just zzz and burn the edges together, basically. And that's pretty darn cool, to the tune of several $1,000s. For several $1,000s, I can buy a lot of tape. For about $1,500, there's a machine you can buy called a Colibri machine that instead of using Mylar, uses polyethylene. And they have pockets, and it'll do the same kind of, it'll just burn the polyethylene together. So that's another option. But again, for $1,500, I can buy a lot of tape. This is 3M number 415 double-sided tape, which is the only acceptable tape. It's number 415 double-sided tape. And all of the major archival suppliers will sell it. And 1/4 inch is probably the width you want to buy. I think it comes as wide as like a foot, but 1/4 inch is what you need. And you can come up close to me if you can't see what I am doing, because I know that I am far away from you, and this is small and low contrast, because I can barely see what I'm doing in this room. So this tape is very, very, very sticky around the edges. So when you buy a roll of your own, you never want to put it down on the countertop or the tabletop like this, because it will pick up every single piece of whatever is on there. And especially when you're encapsulating, when it's going to be visible, you'll see it, and every time you look at it, you will see it and you will be irritated. So keep it in a plastic bag. Put it down on a piece of wax paper or something that's lint-free, dust-free, and you'll be much happier with your results. Okay, so here we go. And I'm just going to start out by having my piece of Mylar, putting my object down and putting some weight around it. And I'm going to go, I don't want to go right to the edge because I don't ever want this to get in the tape. And I'm just going to lay this out. Use my knife to cut. And one of the tricks about this is you don't want your you don't want your tape to touch. You want to leave gaps of maybe 1/4 of an inch or so at the edges. And that's so that, in theory, you might get some air circulation going on in there. You might get some fresh air coming in and some acids going out. I also tend to think that we're mostly just doing that to make ourselves feel better, but I will take it. I told you all it was the last class of the day. I'm really honest. And then you have a bone folder, and you just take your bone folder and make sure everything is good and stuck. So when you are done, if you are lucky, it will look like this. So again, if you can't see what I'm doing, come on up. Because I have to get close so I can see. So now I'm going to put just straighten this up a little bit, and drop my next piece of Mylar on top of this and weight it. So hopefully things will not move around very much. And then take a deep breath. The worst thing that happens if you screw this up is that you cut it off and you start again. So unless you screw it up a whole lot and get tape on your object, but we're just not going to go there. It's not going to happen to any of you because you're going to be really careful. So weight it, and then I tend to pull off 1, 2. So I tend to do like the first 2, and I use my bone folder to really make sure everything is adhered. And then I think probably in the directions they tell you to use a squeegee, which I have never used a squeegee to do this in my life. I just kind of use my hand to flatten it out, and I might go nuts and move it closer to me so that I'm working on my right hand, and pull off the other 2. It gets harder because there's fewer edges that will lift. And again, use your bone folder to make sure that it is completely adhered. And if we are lucky, when you are done, you will end up with this. You will note that mine is completely lopsided and scraggly and messy, but that's okay because once everyone is done with that, we're going to trim. So the last thing you do, well, the next to last thing you do, you've probably figured out, is just cut around the outside of the tape, maybe leaving about 1/4 of an inch of an edge around it. And the reason we want to leave a little bit of room instead of cutting right up to the edge is that this is an acrylic adhesive, and that means that when it deteriorates, it'll spread a little bit. So if we leave that 1/4 of an inch, it's not going to ooze out onto anything else. So hopefully now we all have, or once we get done cutting, we'll have this. They're getting cuter. They are getting cuter. So the last thing we're going to do, because these, if you feel those corners, they are very pokey, pokey, pokey sharp. And if you are dealing with a lot of fragile objects, those corners might be sharp enough to do some damage to your paper. So the last thing we're going to do is round the corners. And as we were just talking about, it would be really great if we had a corner rounding punch. And you can buy them for scrapbooking and greeting cards, or if you have a budget, You can buy a nice floor-mounted one that works on a foot pedal. It's pretty great. But we are just going to use our knives and freehand it, and that's going to work well enough. And so I'm just going to take off the tip of that corner so it's not quite so sharp and pointy. And those corners are also the first things that get banged up on this, so it'll look nicer longer. You're probably noticing that it's not slipping around in there very much, and that's because there's a pretty good static field associated with Mylar. What this means for our purposes when we're encapsulating is if we have a document that's in pieces, we can reassemble it in the encapsulation and it'll tend to hang together, which is pretty great. You can also take it, I would not encourage this with collection material, but you can take it and crumple it up like this, and the Mylar is going to take the damage much more than your paper. Like I said, wouldn't encourage it, but just on the off chance, my paper is folded, but the bigger folds are in the Mylar. And to get something out of the encapsulation, maybe you're having some kind of an event and you want to be able to let people see something that's really important, but you don't need it to be encapsulated all the time. But you're having 200 fourth graders through, and who knows where their hands have been. So you might encapsulate something, and then you can just cut it out later. So it's pretty nifty for that kind of thing as well.